It's like a theory, isn't it?
Higgs boson? Absolutely no idea.
Oh my God, this was in the Big Bang Theory.
I don't know. I don't know.
It's probably everywhere. Maybe it's even inside all of us and everything.
A kind of radiation.
Kind of got a feeling that it might be something about legs.
It's a big, big donut with energy flying around it and sort of nuclear Big Bang effect going on somewhere.
It's a bit tricky to explain, but let's have a go. The Higgs boson was first proposed in 1964 by Peter Higgs as part of a theory that explains how some particles get mass. Physicists spent almost 50 years looking for it using huge particle accelerators until they built the biggest and most powerful of all, the Large Hadron Collider here at CERN, which finally cornered the Higgs in 2012. Cheers, Peter. All right, I'm getting to that. Now, imagine an invisible energy field that fills the entire universe, represented by this rather small tray of mysterious black liquid. Very good. Now, as a particle passes through the field, it interacts with it and gains mass, like this. Not bad, huh? The Higgs field is invisible, like air. The only way you know it's there is by making a sound or ripple in it. So, if we can create a ripple in the Higgs field, then we can prove it exists. And it's this ripple that shows up as a new particle, the legendary Higgs boson. Of course, you will need a £5 billion, 27-kilometre long super collider to find it.
Thank you very much indeed. And I was half tempted to ask Stephen Hawking if he wanted to put a bet on the outcome of this discussion, but it sounds like he might have lost enough money recently anyway on the Nobel Prize. Anyway, I think it should be a fascinating discussion. My first guest is Nima Arkani-Hamed, one of the world's most exciting and interesting theoretical physicists from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's also an avid reader. He particularly likes the work of Alice Munro, and luckily enough for today, also the novels of Ian McEwan. Ian, as I'm sure you all know, is one of our best-loved, most successful novelists, both getting critical acclaim and mass readership as well, which isn't always the case. He's very interested in the subject of our discussion today, and he said himself that something is missing in our culture. We overvalue the arts in relation to the sciences. And it's at that point that I wanted to start off, before we move on to what similarities there might be, but to this perceived gulf. And I was wondering, Ian, whether you could describe for us how you think this manifests itself.
Well, that old two-culture matter, I think, is still with us. I mean, ever since Snow promulgated it back in the 50s. It still is possible to be a flourishing public intellectual with absolutely no reference to science. It still can go on, but it's happening less and less. And I think it's less a change of any decision in the culture at large, just a social reality pressing in on us. It was touched on just briefly earlier this evening that bioethics is now a critical matter. We all carry around with us miraculous tiny machines that involve at least some passing admiration for the engineering that created them. And it's true also, climate change forces us to, those of us who have no interest in science, to at least get a smattering of some idea of what it is to predict systems that have more than 2 or 3 variables, and whether this is even possible. So I think it's being borne in on us. It's now, for example, the internet has created sites like John Brockman's wonderful site, edge.org, I think it's called now, where it's possible for laymen to sit in on conversations between scientists. And when scientists have to address each other out of their specialisms, they have to speak a lingua franca of plain English. They have to abandon their jargons, and we're the beneficiaries of that.
You, in the past, Nima, you've expressed frustration at people in intellectual circles who have no knowledge of science.
Well, it's an asymmetry that doesn't really need to exist. Certainly, many scientists are very appreciative of the arts. Many of my colleagues are very fine musicians. That there's tremendous aesthetic appreciation for the arts. The essential gulf is one of language, obviously, and especially for our part of physics, and especially in theoretical physics, the basic difficulty is that most people don't understand our language of mathematics, with which we use to describe everything we know about the universe. And so, while I'm capable of listening to and intensely enjoying a Beethoven sonata or an Ian McEwan novel, and can attest for myself that Ian's a spectacular novelist, it can be more difficult for people in the arts to have some appreciation for what we do. And it might be harder, so Ian may have to take on someone else's authority that I'm a decent theoretical physicist. And so that's I think part of the origin of the asymmetry. But I think at a deeper level, there's a really essential kind of commonality between. And I'm not saying it's at a sort of kumbaya, why don't we all get along kind of level, because
no guitars, please.
But there are certain parts of the arts and certain parts of the sciences that I think have very deep similarities, cultural similarities, intellectual similarities, and I think these are worth exposing and talking about and thinking about.
How would you describe attitudes of your fellow writers towards science?
Well, I think that it's very diverse. I mean, it's very plural. It's we are a vast army of novelists and poets. There are more of us than I sometimes think than readers. But within that, I think I have friends who have absolutely, no less than zero interest in science, and others who have a great deal. Just to pick up on something Nima said, of course, how are we out here ever going to read Dirac's equation and understand it? I mean, the furthest I got, I'm one of those know-nothing liberal arts students who at the age of 16 remember a maths teacher coming into the room saying, I'll take 10 of you who volunteers and I'll get you through A-level maths. So us English, history, French types went and were patiently taken through. And it was, I'd have to say, the most intellectually difficult and delightful thing I ever did. And the highest I got was the calculus. To understand how it was invented between Newton and Leibniz, I thought that I had reached my intellectual ceiling. Now that's first steps for any maths undergraduate, but it gave me a taste for the sort of respect. And I could well imagine a society, and the Greeks had it at one point, where you couldn't really claim to be any sort of intellectual at all, or be living the life of the mind, unless you had some kind of foot in the world of mathematics. So I think we're in a situation of awkward respect. You go into Westminster Cathedral and Dirac's equation is carved in stone. Graham Farmilow tells me that its elements, this was a conversation we had some months ago, its various elements are much and very beautifully condensed. But to stand there and look at it, I think even for those of us who have very little grasp of maths, can be a kind of aesthetic experience.
But it does remain that distance that you were talking about in periods of the past. I mean, certainly in ancient Greece, but definitely in the Renaissance, figures like Leonardo, it was apparently, I mean, the man was a genius, but it was possible to span these worlds at an area of excellence that just doesn't seem so possible now.
It's certainly true, and making any progress on the questions before us today certainly requires a degree of specialization. We have to get 6,000 people to work on these colossal experiments in order to finally verify theories that were written down 50 years ago. And that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen without a lot of purpose. But I think that there is some way of making progress. One of the things that we try to do sometimes in explaining what's going on in physics, especially, is find useful analogies and metaphors to what might be going on, and that's great. That's great to a point, and it conveys some sense for what the concepts and the ideas are. But I think that there's something even more fundamental that we could be doing a better job with, which is explaining the structure in which we're having these thoughts, explaining why we're doing what we're doing, explaining the pursuit of truth with a capital T, which is underlying all of it. What it is that motivates people when they wake up in the morning to do these crazy things with their life. And to spend 1, 2, 3 decades working with not necessarily a payoff in sight until every now and then we celebrate these tremendous achievements. There is something essentially there is an obsessive element to it which should be familiar to the artist. There is an obsessive element to it which should be familiar to many people in society. And it's driven by the pursuit of something much bigger than ourselves, and of being able to connect to something which is much bigger than the little trivial concerns of everyday life.
And these very questions are ones which have been addressed by writers through the ages. I mean, Stephen Hawking raised the question of why is there something rather than nothing, and that those kind of existential themes permeate many people's work.
Yes, and on that question, it's very hard to imagine an answer that would, what an answer would be. But anyway, just come back to your first question. There's something else I'd want to say on this, which is that the humanities, as taught in the universities, have actually helped push the two cultures further apart in some ways. Mm-hmm. So when Nima speaks of truth, well, in many humanities departments in universities, noses will wrinkle at this.
That's why I said it.
We are, you know, we have faced a great struggle. The humanities have captured the word theory, for example, and really talk of science as, you know, it's just one more game in town, as it were. Ideologically, it's related to power, it's related to all kinds of other societal things, and truth becomes relative. And I lost a few friends over the onset of theory in the humanities, and it was like a kind of intellectual blindness that fell across the world for 25 years. I think a whole generation of kids were lost. If you went to a university to talk to people about what they're reading, they were reading very little of primary source material. English literature students even were not reading novels or poems. They were reading how to read such things. And, and the whole culture found itself at odds with words like truth. This was simply a highly negotiable, rather flimsy construct. I think this moment is passing, but let's hope.
It's passing from the humanities into our politics, unfortunately.
Yes.
That's a whole other discussion. But just going back to you when you were saying that you need to explain your mission, as it were, and the ideas of truth, and you said that the use of metaphor can be illuminating. Perhaps you could give us an example of that.
Well, it's sometimes illuminating. For instance, it's something we just saw in this discussion of the Higgs. It's a very common metaphor for describing the Higgs particle. It's this idea of the universe filled with something, and the little ball bearing or whatever it was passing through the fluid, picking up some inertia. That's a good example of it's a good example of a metaphor that gives some sense for what's actually going on. There's a difficulty with metaphors, which is that you can't take them too far. They're not literally what's going on. And often when that analogy is used, there's some clever person in the audience, normally a 12-year-old kid, who puts up their hand and says, "Excuse me, isn't that just like the ether? Didn't you guys learn anything? You know, this was, of course, before the Higgs was discovered. Didn't you learn anything? It's really dumb to reinvent the ether." And then we had to say, yes, that was only a metaphor. Trust us. That's always we always have to say that's trust us so we know what we're talking about. It's something that fills the universe that's not like the ether. So that there's always a limitation to the idea of there's a limitation to these metaphors, and it's important to remember that. It is possible to actually explain some of these things. This is one of the wonderful things about fundamental physics. The essential ideas are simple. And in fact, the essential open questions are very simple to state. The possible answers to them are more complicated to talk about, but the essential issues at stake, that's what attracts us to the subject. The essential questions are deep and they're simple to state. And with some patience, it's actually possible to address them in really a head-on way and get a sense for what's going on without all the details of the mathematics. But it requires a very engaged audience, and it can't be done casually. There's a spectacular book about cosmology that was written in the late 1970s by Steven Weinberg, who's one of the heroes of our subjects. Dreams of the Final Theory is yet another spectacular book, but even earlier than that was a little textbook. It wasn't a textbook, a little popular book about cosmology called The First 3 Minutes. And this is a serious book about cosmology. I, as a graduate student, learned cosmology began learning cosmology, not from the textbooks, which I found very difficult to understand, but by reading this popular book. And he says in the beginning of this book that this, my target audience is a tough old economist, someone who's willing to spend the time and actively engage with the subject and try to understand it. If you're willing to do that, it's possible to talk about all of these things at some more serious level of accuracy. And we could be doing that more as a scientist too. So I think I take us to task to some extent for not doing more of that, because you also get a sense when you really understand things a little bit more deeply about how rigid this entire framework is that we're talking about here. It's one of the extraordinary things. Often when we talk in terms of these metaphors, you get the sense in your head, well, that's one way things could be. Couldn't it be some totally different way, which would go along with some completely different sets of words that would describe it? But what we've understood about physics in the last 50 years is that there's almost no choices in what the universe can be like. It's an extraordinary fact. And that means that we're also in a tremendous straitjacket when it comes to trying to address some of the puzzles that we face. And the discovery of the Higgs by Peter and his friends is an example of something like that. That there weren't 15 million other things that it could be other than the Higgs. It was almost inevitable that something like the Higgs had to exist, and it was sitting there, and it was discovered in the process of exploring this very, very rigid and tight structure that's thrust upon us. So that rigidity is really remarkable, and is something else which allows us to explore the subject with a certain aesthetic sense, an aesthetic sense which is tied to that very rigidity. And I think that's something else which we have in common with, again, some of the arts. I certainly think certain stripes of novelists like Ian, for example.
And when you've read so widely in this field, and when you hear about the rigidity of these structures and recent discoveries, does that change the way that you look at the world and the way that you look at humanity?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Nima has written, I think, absolutely stunning essay for the layman called "The Future of Theoretical Physics." There's not a line of maths in it. I'm not going to pretend it's easy reading, but in fact, you wrote it, I think, for anyone who's interested in that question outside the field. And I think we've lived through a golden age, really, of science writing, in the biological field as well, through neuroscience and through neo-Darwinism. And I often think that actually, if one was inventing a core curriculum for teaching in schools, the best way would be not necessarily mathematics, it would be applied mathematics or probability, because there are some things in science that are important that are fairly simple to understand. Maybe not so easy to state economically, but natural selection is not a very difficult idea, but its consequences cascade beautifully. Bayes' theorem is not very difficult. It's almost arithmetic, and yet it's the applications it now has in neuroscience, again, are formidable. So I think we can cross these fields together. And I'm very interested in the aesthetics of this, because you mentioned Weinberg, and I immediately thought of The Dreams of the Final Theory, because in there is an essay on the race to prove general relativity. And Weinberg is suggesting that actually this theorem was in the textbooks before the really final proofs were there, which were not till the early 50s and radio astronomy, and that what pushed it was too beautiful not to be true. And that famous remark, Jim Watson says that, when Rosalind Franklin came to look at his and Crick's model of DNA molecule, that it was too beautiful not to be true. Again, we come into this field in which the aesthetics of something that is, in the Keatsian sense, beautiful and true, must embrace both subjects, all fields, as it were.
And this is something that's very important to you, isn't it? You see the great commonality of beauty between art and science.
Absolutely. So here I'm saying things that are said much more masterfully by Weinberg in Dreams of the in this book. I encourage you all to read Dreams of the Final Theory. But we often talk, especially in theoretical physics and mathematics, of the idea of beauty in theories. And I think if this is interpreted loosely, you won't get really a sense of what we mean. We have to be a little more specific when we talk about it. Ideas that we find beautiful, theories that we find beautiful, it's not a capricious aesthetic judgment. It's not fashion, it's not sociology. It's not something that you might find beautiful today, but won't find beautiful 10 years from now, or people might not have found beautiful if it was properly explained to them 50 years ago. The things that we find beautiful today, well, we suspect to be beautiful for all eternity. And the reason is what we mean by beauty is really a shorthand for something else. The laws that we find describe nature somehow have a sense of inevitability about them. There's very few principles, very few principles, and there's no possible other way they could work once you understand them deeply enough. It's hard to figure out what those principles are. For a long time they're obscured, and a lot of progress is driven by trying to expose them. But once you see them, everything else, just one thing goes after another. You don't have to be clever, you don't have to invent anything, you don't have to be ingenious. The word deep replaces the word clever at every turn. And everything falls into place because it couldn't possibly be any other way in accordance with its own logical structure. So that's what we mean when we say ideas are beautiful. Incidentally, we also use the word pretty and cute to describe ideas, and that doesn't mean the same thing. It means it does sound more diminutively like what it's like. It's clever, it's ingenious, it's cool, it's nice. But beautiful means something else. Beautiful are things that have this sense of rigidity and inevitability about them. And for a long time, I suspected that the truly great, beautiful things in art had to have the same sense behind them. Of course, ultimately, what gives us our sense, what gives us the rules, what gives us a sense of right and wrong, and constraint, which is ultimately what the beauty is reflecting, is nature. And these few principles that govern the laws of nature that we've learned about and we're learning more about. In at least some of the arts, that constraint in the architecture is something that's self-imposed. But if the rules are good, then the inevitable things that they give rise to have to have this same kind of crystalline beauty to them. And I found it extraordinary. About a year ago, I ran into these on YouTube. I ran into this great lecture by Leonard Bernstein. He has this wonderful series of lectures on music. But this particular one that I've told all my friends about is about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, about the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And Bernstein, in talking about this piece that we all, every school kid in the world knows, amazingly to me, used precisely this language, not approximately this language, exactly this language of inevitability, perfect accordance to its internal logical structure, and how difficult and tortuous it was for Beethoven to figure out how to start with da-da-da-da and end it and complete it in this spectacular fashion, such that every note inevitably preceded the one that came before it. The amazing thing is that he found all these discarded pieces of music that Beethoven had put in to various places, and Bernstein guessed where they would go in the movement, and he put them in, and it ruined everything. They were horrible, just terrible. So it wasn't easy to do this thing that seemed to flow so inevitably and perfectly from that first starting point. Of course,
very important.
But I found extraordinary. He used precisely the same language we use in mathematics and theoretical physics to describe our sense of aesthetics and beauty.
It's so interesting, though, to hear you talk about beauty as being a goal, as an ambition, as something that you recognise. And I just wonder whether in the field of modern arts, just as you said that truth had been lost in theory, is beauty a goal?
You don't hear beauty much mentioned even by composers in relation to modern music. It's not the common pursuit. I mean, for my taste, all atonal music sounds like an expression of anxiety rather than anything else. So maybe, I mean, Beethoven wrote that Fifth Symphony round about the time it was, for the very last time possible, for someone interested in the life of the mind to understand most of what was going on in science and most of what was going on. I mean, in the early 19th century, that probably was the parting of the ways. And yet, I think we do need a return to this in the arts. I don't think we have much trouble in poetry with this. Let's take Seamus Heaney died recently, and so there was a lot of time to reflect on his work. And the beauty of those lines of his work was constantly referenced. So there we're fine. We find beauty in self-organizing systems in nature. And Nima and I, before we came on, were talking about this picture and were saying it is extremely beautiful, that thing that's behind the white rectangle there. Created out of utility and necessity by engineers and meeting the definite intellectual pursuits of theoretical physicists. But without intending to, they make a thing, a photograph or a picture that is of itself innately beautiful, and there they replicate, you know, the beauty of, say,
thank you.
There you are.
Could you get the graphics off? Utility can be a terrible thing. You know, the beauty of a cauliflower, or you know, in which we see, you know, the fascination of one bit of it always replicating the whole. So I think there is a need, especially in music, I think, to bring us back to this notion. Part of the problem, I think, was modernism, of the great aesthetic revolution of the early 20th century, to which we are all bound and must work in gratitude for. But we lost certain things, and along the way, emotion and art were somewhat detached. When I was a student at Sussex University, we were constantly asked to reflect on, and I even have to write essays on, a statement by the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, in which he said, "Tears and laughter are aesthetic frauds." This was the pure high modernist statement that you had to detach those feelings about emotion and beauty from art itself. And then in the novel, we saw it reach its apogee, I think, in the experimental novels of Rob Grier, trying to bring that sense of involvement of the emotion and the beauty in the object out of the art. You cannot do that with poetry, really. I think poetry is too tied, and I hope we get a chance to talk about time both in art and time in the dispensations of theoretical physics. Poetry is concerned with the point, that moment of human emotion, maybe the lyric poem, the moment of love. The novel, on the other hand, looks at human fate over time. And I really want to ask Nima whether he thinks time is real. Would it return us? Could we then enter the fold of theoretical physics if you were to assure us that although you might want to abolish space-time, that we could say the universe has been getting more and more complex. It can only do this through time. Perhaps time is real, not just a function of consciousness or...
Well, certainly in every practical and we can have a long discussion about what the word real means, but
time. That'll keep us going for a couple of hours.
But that's anyway. Discussing what real means is probably not a very interesting thing to do anyway. It's
the universe has been getting more interesting. Is that right?
That's certainly true. It's getting more complex and more interesting. And so so time is obviously a very useful idea. Obviously, I forget who it was who said, if we didn't have time, everything would happen at once. So time certainly exists. But we've gotten used to many ideas about the world around us, which are crucial to our existence and the way we think about things, which we have come to realize are approximations to something else. And now we have an interesting divergence between really different parts of science. The vast majority of science is really properly focused on understanding the workings of our universe, things we see around us, and understanding it better and better. And a small but important to us part is devoted to these frontier questions of what the building blocks are, what the rules are, what everything derives from. Right?
Rather ruin things for us when you yoked time and space together.
Well, that's the beginning of the end, indeed.
Yeah, it is the beginning of the end for us novelists, at least. So that when we read that gravity is a function of the curvature of space-time, think, oh my God, surely time is a thing in itself.
Well, so that we already know without any extra speculation. We know that time and space can morph into each other very, very smoothly, and in situations like Stephen was reminding us about earlier in black holes, what looks like a direction of time and a direction of space can merge, can morph one into the other. So we absolutely don't have. They are special conditions, but there are things that can happen. We believe there are black holes in our universe, and this phenomenon actually does happen.
But I think where is the novel without time?
But of course there is time does exist as a useful concept, as an organizing concept. But many of us do suspect that space and with it time can't be fundamental. It must somehow emerge from something else. There are lots of reasons to suspect that this is true. And in fact, we have circumstantial theoretical evidence that it's true. And we have more circumstantial, less circumstantial, quite solid theoretical evidence that space can emerge from no space.
But maybe space is the illusion.
It could be,
and time is the real thing.
But precisely because space and time are yoked to each other in this way, it's hard to imagine space emerging without somehow time emerging along for the ride.
Because religions want, various points have wanted to tell us that all time is one, and the famous beginning of the four quartets of Eliot proposed time as just not flowing, not left to right, not the past becoming the present becoming the future. And physics have lined up behind this too, an unlikely alliance between physics and religion. I just wondered if you were ever going to rescue us from this. And certainly reading your essay, I got a hint that maybe you were a little seeing the future of a possibility in which time might be restored to its unique value.
Oh, I don't know how you got that impression from my essay.
Projection.
It wasn't quite as stunning as you said then. No, but
you can't control your reading.
well, no, sorry, so let me maybe say this. We sometimes say these things that maybe somewhat mysteriously, space-time has got to emerge from other building blocks and so on. But if someone comes along tomorrow and says, "Here is my whiz-bang theory for where space-time comes from," the first test that it needs to pass is to reproduce ordinary space and time in the conditions in which we expect these ideas are actually applicable and useful. That's highly non-trivial. It's very difficult to, it's very easy to invent sort of random pictures for what might get rid of it, which in no approximation give us what looks like our experience of space and time. And that's one of the central conceptual challenges to this program, is to figure out where the heck could this, how could this possibly happen? And it could be that that there are some rules for describing what happens at the very, very end when everything is finished happening, which doesn't in itself have time built into it, but where there's some sort of approximation for figuring out what eventually happened at the very, very end that looks like approximate evolution through time.
Interesting that Professor Hawkins' last illustration gave us, milliseconds, seconds, 3 minutes. I mean, time was its crucial.
And yet, at the very, very end, he had the little jagged line, the quantum gravity wall, where all of these notions of space and time appear to break down. It maybe isn't very. I mean, perhaps it doesn't do us much good to talk about this because we don't know the answer, and very, very often. Well, no, of course, no, but I mean, but maybe what I really meant to say is that very often progress on these questions happens in a highly chaotic way. Very, very often. We don't even know we're asking the right question until we happen to be in possession of the correct answer or close to the correct answer. And only then do we realize that the cart comes before the horse all the time, and we're sort of stumbling around, and we find bits and pieces of the correct conceptual framework that only in hindsight we can fit together in this way. So we're at that moment now where we don't know what makes sense and what doesn't make sense when it comes to thinking about these questions. We just know that our standard description of physics needs some modification.
Does Nima's description of the kind of thought processes going on in science, do you think that in any way mirrors the creative act for a writer or for an artist?
Well, I often wonder what theoretical physicists do all day. And my fantasy is that they're rather like novelists. They sit around with their feet on the radiator, staring out the window, with a notepad within reach. They're not all in CERN. There are too many of them. And so they must be in the world of that kind of misty, drifting, creative thinking that has a bit of talent, a bit of luck, a bit of being shaped by current mood that can bring you to a sudden insight, or to sit around and wonder how to progress or even start a novel is to enter a state of what V.S. Pritchett called determined stupor. And those of us who are paid to be in states of determined stupor count ourselves very lucky. So I think that there must be some overlap in this.
Well, such a scientist's block.
That's called my everyday life. I've always thought that composers and novelists are probably very, very close to mathematicians and theoretical physicists psychologically in how they go about things. Perhaps contrary to a certain sort of mythology, people don't go to their offices and just churn through equations one after the other in some systematic way to go from A and end up at B and say, aha, now I have succeeded, page 2.
That's how it's done in the movies.
It never, ever works that way. In fact, there's an aspect, and in saying this, I'm claiming no special knowledge of this creative process. That this is, I think, common to all of us who do this, and it's also a wonderful commonality between the very small discoveries that people like me make and important big discoveries. Even if we're not the ones making the important big discoveries, it's clear that this process is very similar in even the little things we do and the giants that we revere so much. The process is a little bit more something like this. You have a certain set of questions you're trying to solve, And you have to imagine what the story could possibly be for what the solution is. You have to try to imagine what the sort of a global answer could possibly look like, or at least chunks of the global answer could look like. You try on stories. Could it work like that? Could it work like that? And of course, often because of the underlying rigidity, the same thing that gives rise to the beauty that we talked about in all these examples. It's beauty because there's a right and wrong. There's some problem that's being solved. If the story is a great story, it has a better chance of being right than if it's a crappy story. And of course, sometimes the stories are too good to be true, and that happens very, very often. And so most of the time what we do is we sort of try out what could possibly be solutions to the problems, and then we have to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as we possibly can. And that's what 99% of our life is about. We try out stories and we prove them wrong. We make conjectures, we check them against all kinds of data. The data can be data from the real world experiments. The data can be internal theoretical consistency checks on what we're doing. And it almost never works. It almost never, ever works. So you have this experience of failing day after day after day. And it's a particularly intensely bad feeling to fail so much because you know what success looks like. And you can't fool yourself when you're not there. So even though you don't know what the solution is, you know when you don't have it. And so you have to keep going and going until gradually you fail better and better and better. And every now and then, once every 2 or 3 years, something works. And
sounds even worse than stupid.
Well, no, that is stupid, I think. That's a perfect description of it.
But it's fascinating, this idea of competing narratives, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, here is a major difference. I mean, because Nima has got a clear sense of what would be right, and there are although I have to say, multiple universes, 11 dimensions. Sounds fantastically inelegant to me, but 11, it was 10. I think you were onto something when it was 10. 11. I mean, this brings us to another point of, is it divergence as well as some convergence, which is originality. I'm well aware in science how important it is to be first. Be second with structure of DNA will consign you to the dustbin of history. Whereas every novelist knows that he or she terrible novel is unique. You are in a self-sustaining world in which whatever you say is so. It's for others to accept it or reject it. So we do have battles every now and then. A plagiarism storm comes up. But there we know what we're talking about. But I often pity those scientists who are in a race just to get on the public record for the first time days, weeks before someone else. And your life can be transformed. I mean, Crick and Watson are a perfect case of this. And the double helix, by the way, I think is one of the most eccentric and beautiful books of how a scientific discovery is made, and all the contingencies that around that and all the personalities. But if Pauling had got there before them, we certainly wouldn't have heard of Jim Watson, I think. We would have heard of Crick in a later time. And Jim Watson himself has said it was the luckiest thing he was to meet Crick and be involved in this sort of personal chemistry that drove them forward. So it's a tougher world, I think.
Yes, real anguish there.
This is of course a fascinating subject because it's one of the classic things that we talk about for the difference between art and science. Even here, I think there's more commonality than meets the eye, which I'll get around to in a second. But I want to say one thing about originality at an even sort of baser level of how easy it is to be original, how much sort of innate, intrinsic talent is needed to be able to do something. And here we actually have, I think, an advantage. and the advantage is precisely that there is this thing out there that we're not inventing, but we're discovering. And because of that, all you have to do is get somewhere in the neighborhood of the truth. You don't have to get particularly close to it. You just have to know that it's there. And then you have to not fight it and just let it to drag you in toward itself. If you're very talented, you might hack your way there more quickly. If you're less talented, you might have to pinball around, and it takes a little longer to get there. But if you're in the basin of attraction of a correct idea, you have a very powerful friend, which is ultimately nature itself, and the powerful consistency of these ideas themselves that drag you towards it, regardless of really, at some very deep level, the aptitude you have for the questions involved. This is something we see over and over again. There are a wide range of talents, especially in theoretical physics, that are represented for major discoveries, and it's for this reason. It's because you're not really inventing something. You're discovering things that are out there already, and you have to get close, and that's mostly what you have to do.
That fateful morning, when one of his children, 2-year-old, was extremely ill, and Darwin opened a 20-page letter from Wallace and said, all my originality is smashed. And it was only his friends who said, no, here's a scheme, come before the Linnaean Society, and fortunately D comes before W in the alphabet. And that was the convention at the Linnaean. We read paper from Darwin, paper from Wallace. But the anxiety attack that Darwin had there, no novelist could have such a thing. But unless you're in a world of a Borges story, Pierre Menard, who rewrote Don Quixote word for word without actually copying it, just reinvented it. This doesn't actually happen outside of Borges.
But this very fact that we're both talking about, that makes it possible for multiple people to discover the same thing at the same time, on the one hand seems to remove, in some deep sense, the purpose of the individual scientist in the process. What you're talking about, the anxiety, who gets the credit, and so on, this is important to the individuals involved. It's of no importance in the grand scheme of things, obviously.
See it by funerals.
And, right. But there is an important sense in which even the same discoveries, even the same existing body of knowledge, the things that are sitting there in textbooks for hundreds of years already, are perceived in different ways by different individual scientists who are practicing researchers in the subject, and it's because to be able to do anything new, you have to organize the existing body of knowledge and what came before in some unique way that's your way of thinking about it. That's not someone else's way of thinking about it, and it can't just be about the new things. It really has to be about everything. It's one of the real pleasures in our business of getting to know your colleagues. Isn't it just about the latest, greatest thing they're working on, but they have some view, some perspective on all of physics that comes before it, that organizes even the most basic standard things that we all know inside out in different, quite unique, quite fascinating ways. And one of the things which is one of the more invariant reasons, not just who gets the credit, but one of the deeper reasons why it's important to have different people approaching the same problem, even if they end up solving it and finding the same solution, is the path towards a solution suggests many divergent ways things could progress in the future. And having many of those paths is still useful. It's not always useful, but it's been useful many times. The different ways in which you see the ideas and the object, the different emphases, the different perspectives, suggest different ways the ideas can be generalized, different things that can come first, different starting principles. And so it still pays off to have lots of people doing the thinking. A really great example is general relativity. So Einstein had this very geometrical point of view, about about gravity and space-time, the things that we say in all the popular books, which is definitely correct, and played a big role in his own development of the subject. But over the years, we've discovered totally different ways of thinking about the same physics, so it's not obvious ahead of time whether the first way you discover something ends up being the best way to eventually think about it when you have to make the next steps. So even in this case, it's not quite as bad, even though there is the sting of being scooped, but those are all basic trivialities, that there's still some good purpose in having different paths of the same outcome.
As we begin to draw this discussion to an end, I'm aware that I haven't really asked you, Ian, very much about the influence of science on your own work. I mean, clearly you're reading widely for its own sake because you're engaged and interested, but it has influenced some of your knowledge, particularly solar, I would suggest.
Well, it has, but I think novelists are lucky that they can, sitting down to write a novel is roughly about the time of an undergraduate university course. And you might draw on the work of a historian, you might need to read a biography of a composer, or you might... In other words, I would like to feel that we could think about science as just one more aspect of organized human curiosity, rather than as a special compartment. And it has, as has been very clear, I think, from this discussion, a powerful aesthetic. It also has, wonderful human clashes and all the rest of it, as does every other human field. But I think we need to generalize it. We need to absorb it into our sense that we can love the music of Beethoven without being composers, without being musicians. And we could love science as a celebration of human ingenuity without being scientists or mathematicians. It has had a huge effect on my own sense of the world. It certainly has helped me along the way to a general embracing global skepticism about religion. I don't think these are two distinct magisteria. I think they're entirely opposed. The world of faith is, I think, inimical to the world of science. And in that sense, science has helped me want to write books every now and then which are in celebration of a full-blooded rationalism. It's one of our delightful aspects, and it informs what we try to do with our laws and our legislations and our social policy. We don't succeed a lot of the time. It's very hard to make human institutions that are irrational, but the impulse is powerfully there. And we despair of human relationships at the very most private level when they're irregular or contradictory. We demand even of our lovers a degree of coherence. And behind that lies a notion of consistency and rationality. So science is one case of that. And the novel I wrote, Enduring Love, was actually a novel wishing to oppose the romantic notion that abstraction and logic and rationality, and science in particular, was a cold-hearted thing. A myth, I think, which began with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We need to reclaim our own sense of the full-bloodedness, of the warmth, really, of what's rational.
Celebration of the rational. A final word from you, Nima. I'm sure that's something you'd agree with.
He said it perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, we really have kind of overrun our time, but it was such an interesting discussion. So I want to thank you both very much indeed. Thank you very much to the audience for. I hope you enjoyed our brief history of beauty, art, truth, and indeed time. Thank you very much indeed to both of my guests. Thank you very much.